Russian authorities yesterday named several Americans who they want to question who they claim were involved in Bill Browder's quote-unquote crimes in their terms, including former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Does President Trump support that idea? Is he open to having U.S. officials questioned by Russia?
The president's going to meet with his team, and we'll let you know when we have an announcement on that.
For a second, is that a topic that came up in their conversation? Did President Putin raise this with President Trump?
There was some conversation about it, but there wasn't a commitment made on behalf of the United States, and the president will work with his team, and we'll let you know if there's an announcement on that front.
The questioning by Maggie Haberman of the New York Times, and that was notably not a no. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders would not rule out the possibility of somehow letting Russian officials question American citizens, including, most notably, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. She says she's going to get back to us on that. In Helsinki, we heard Putin suggest the U.S. could interview Russians indicted in the Mueller investigation if Russia was allowed to question Americans. President Trump called it an interesting idea. Tuesday, the Russian prosecutor's office said it wants to question one Mike McFaul and several other Americans as part of its investigation into financier Bill Browder for what the Russians say are financial crimes. Browder, will remind you, an outspoken critic of Putin, lobbied Congress to pass something called the Magnitsky Act, which imposed sanctions on Russia for human rights violations. Well, today, the State Department spokesperson, Heather Nauert, was asked about all of it.
I can't answer on behalf of the White House with regard to that, but what I can tell you is that the overall assertions that have come out of the Russian government are absolutely absurd. The fact that they want to question 11 American citizens and the assertions that the Russian government is making about those American citizens, we do not stand by those assertions that the Russian government makes.
Here to talk about it with us tonight, the aforementioned Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, and we're happy to say an MSNBC international affairs analyst. He is the author of the new book, happens to be germane to the discussion, From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. And Jonathan Lemire is back with us, White House reporter for the Associated Press. You may have seen him questioning Presidents Trump and Putin in Helsinki on Monday. Do I know the people to surround myself with or what? So, Mr. Ambassador, in addition to what Heather Nauert just said, closer to what governments usually say in this event, here's your former boss tonight, John Kerry, former Secretary of State. The administration needs to make it unequivocally clear that in a million years, this wouldn't be under consideration, period, full stop. Not something that should require a half second of consultation. Dangerous. Again, Ambassador McFaul, that's the kind of thing governments say. Were you surprised to not get someone reflexively watching your back from the top of the government at the White House today?
Disappointed, I think, is a better word. Surprised, I guess, although a lot of things that come out of the White House these days are not surprising. I was delighted by what the State Department said. That's an excellent statement. But the weird thing about that statement was that dependent clause at the beginning. I can't speak for the White House. They're all one government. It's the Trump administration. And time and again, when we talk about Russia, it appears like we have two policies. We have one policy by the entire government, and then we have another policy by President Trump. And it just does not serve America's national interest to have that. And number two, something very important here, I want to make sure people understand, by not batting away this as absurd, the president is suggesting that there's moral equivalency between an indictment put out by Mr. Mueller of 12 Russian intelligence officers who violated our sovereignty, and the evidence is overwhelming, with a crazy cockamamie story that makes absolutely no sense, no logical sense, that somehow the U.S. ambassador is helping money laundering. And yet, by not saying that these things are not equivalent, the president is suggesting that there is moral equivalency to that. And I just find it deeply disappointing. I hope they do a better job tomorrow at the press conference.
And are we really led to believe that in that 2-hour meeting on the kind of informational dark side of the moon with only interpreters present, Putin says to Trump, I have a great idea, and here it is? Think of it as kind of a player trade?
Yeah, it's very consistent with the Vladimir Putin I know. Disinformation is a tool that they use all the time. That's why I wrote the whole book about it, Brian, to try to educate the American people just for how dastardly the methods are that he uses both domestically and abroad. And they, you know, the way I interpret it is the indictment came out. They needed something to say. I don't think it's an accident that the number of Americans named is 11, almost the exact same number. And then he's quite an effective storyteller, Vladimir Putin. I've been in those meetings many times, and you know, when you know the facts, you can push back. But if you don't know the facts, you can just kind of nod your head and say, okay, like the president said, that sounds like an interesting idea. And that's just tragic. That means our president was not prepared to go into that meeting for 5 minutes one-on-one with Vladimir Putin, let alone for 2 hours.
You said it yourself. It's all in your book in a manner. You lay out how it is that this could happen, including this passage we've read before about a kind of a tense interplay you had at one point as ambassador with Putin. He turned away to stare intensely at me with his steely blue eyes and stern scowl to accuse me of purposely seeking to ruin U.S.-Russia relations. Putin seemed genuinely angry with me. I was genuinely alarmed. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end and sweat covered my brow as I endured this tongue lashing from one of the most powerful people in the world. And, Ambassador, because we know the stakes and we know what has happened to innocent people on street corners in the UK, a serious question I never thought I'd have to ask you. Do you worry about your life being in danger? Serious answer.
Seriously, no. Although I just had somebody come to my house today to deliver some papers out of the blue. I didn't take them. I wasn't there. So the strange things like that happen. But you read that passage, and I think it's important to understand this is also an act of intimidation against me personally and those other people that are listed there. I'm a critic of Vladimir Putin. I think that what he does abroad and at home are things that we should disagree with. And so this is yet another tactic to intimidate me, like he has done with other people. And I just hope my own president, my commander-in-chief, would understand it for what it is and push back both in public and in private.
Jonathan Lemire, is there any indication on God's green earth that something like this could ever be agreed to? Is this just kind of a cruel 24-hour spooling out of a crazy idea?
If past is prologue, that's probably what this is, that the White House would entertain an idea and would be talked out of it. The other branches of government, we saw a little bit, of course, from the State Department spokeswoman today, members of the Trump administration with cooler heads would prevail. This would be something that the president would sort of float.
While 11 Americans sweat.
Right, of course. Yes, that's not taken into consideration here because this president views things under a very narrow political lens, his own. And in this exchange, and we, of course, are not privy to the details in that private meeting, but you could see it in that news conference that I was in the room for, where that he seemed genuinely enthused by this idea, that there could be this almost investigator swap. And I'm sure his consideration was not at all the ambassador or the other 10 Americans who would be potentially subjected to this, but rather his own hide and how this could affect the Mueller probe. And it would potentially serve to just further muddy the waters. That these Russian investigators would go in and it would slow things down. If in some way this would ever happen, he probably saw it as yet another way to damage the credibility of an investigation that seems to be creeping closer and closer to him in the White House.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.